fellow cyborgs. Today I want to update you on what I've been reading and mostly tell you about all of the horror books I've already read this year. I didn't post a Book-o-lutions video this year because I kind of wanted to keep it casual, but in my mind, one of my main Book-o-lutions was to read more in the horror genre. I've been enjoying the Books in the Freezer podcast as well as Talking Scared podcast, which is all about horror books, and have frequently been adding books to my TBR on Storygraph, and this year I wanted to actually try out those recommendations and see what I actually think about the horror genre. Some of these books that I myself classify as horror are more borderline to thrillers or to dark fantasy, but for this case I want to classify them as horror because I think what we consider as horror should probably be broadened. So let's just go chronologically. The first book I finished in 2022 and the first horror book that I want to talk to you about is Sundial by Katrina Ward. This is Ward's new release for 2022, and Acacia from the Chaotic Little Book Corner was kind enough to send me this ARC copy. She had an extra one and we buddy read this together. This is the second of Ward's books that I have read. I read The Last House on Needless Street late last year. I don't think I talked to you guys about it, but I rated it 4.25 stars and I thought it was excellent. It was very, very good. And I loved specifically the representation of a certain mental illness. So this is less of a sweeping novel. It's significantly shorter as well. This is more of a family drama mixed with science experiments gone wrong and a question of what is really passed down in the blood. This does deal heavily with abusive relationships, not necessarily physically abusive, though that is an element, but mostly emotionally abusive. So this was not a fun or easy read, but it was compelling and I would want to reread this knowing the twists and turns now and rethinking what I originally thought about certain characters. I gave this 4 stars. The next horror book I read was Plain Bad Heroines by Emily Danforth. This is quite a large, it's mostly dark academia, sapphic, thrillery, horror vibe sort of book, and I think that was one of the reasons why I didn't enjoy this as much as a lot of people have. This is a very hyped book. For me, I wanted more of the horror elements, but this seemed to be more of an in-depth character study of our 3 main characters. I also had some issues with the pacing. I felt like the tension was deflated where it could have been built up if it had just been organized differently. But overall, I thought that this was a very admirable book. There were a lot of elements to it I liked, and I think if I had approached it with a different perspective, I would have enjoyed it more for what it actually is. I gave this 3.5 stars. Then I read Flowers for the Sea by Zin E. Rockland. This is a novella. I thought it was going to be cosmic horror, so kind of like Cthulhu mythos, but this is actually more of a post-apocalyptic world and a lot more body horror than anything else. There's a lot of rage and anger in this book, which I found kind of off-putting at the beginning, but I was able to find an essay that Zin E. Rockland wrote under her real name, I believe this is the pen name, in Disabled People Destroy Science Fiction, the special edition of the Uncanny magazine. And I hadn't realized that she is someone who has dealt with chronic pain all of her life, and this very much has to do with body horror regarding an unwanted pregnancy, as well as just body horror over the subjugated circumstances of the main character in this novel, and of her physicality and the chronic pain that she deals with. So after reading that essay, I understood a little bit more about what this was trying to do. It still wasn't totally my favorite thing, but I did give it 3.5 stars. I also finished reading Elatsoe by Darcy Littlebadger. This is a YA dark fantasy more than straight horror, but there are some very horrific elements and horrific creatures in here, so I'm going to count it as horror, like I said I would. I've heard mixed things about this. A lot of people have absolutely loved it, and a lot of people have had issue with the youthful voice of the narrative compared to the fact that our main character is, I believe, 17, and some of the issues that are talked about in here are more mature. Not the most mature, but still. The things that I liked most about here was not only the indigenous and asexual representation, but also the world building elements. The plot I found is mostly a mystery, and mysteries aren't my favorite thing, so I wasn't completely enthralled the whole time, but it was an interesting ride and I really liked the interpretation of ghosts. So this one got a 3.75 stars from me. Then I read The Legend of Skeleton Man by Joseph Bruchac. This is a bind-up of the Skeleton Man duology by Bruchac. This is not a new release by any means, but I really, really enjoyed this. This is definitely one of the horror standouts of the year so far. This is middle grade horror about a young girl, I think her name is Molly, and one weekend her parents don't come back from, I can't remember if they were going on a date or on an errand, but they don't come back. And she doesn't tell anyone, and eventually the school finds out, and they place her with her long lost uncle, and things go from bad to worse. Behind this contemporary timeline, you hear the indigenous story of the Skeleton Man. I don't remember exactly what tribe this is from, so my apologies for no more specifics. And the Skeleton Man is in essence a cannibal. And so we realize that there is more in common with this legend of Skeleton Man and with Molly's situation than perhaps we would like there to be. I got a lot of Count Olaf vibes, even though this predates the Lemony Snicket series. And the horror elements I found were a great blend of, is this actually a supernatural cannibal, or is this just normal everyday horrible things that adults can do to children? Molly doesn't have a ton of horrible things happen to her, so it doesn't get too graphic. This is a middle grade horror, but the anxieties around, where are my parents? I have to find them. Who's this man? Who's looking out for me? Those sorts of things. I thought it was really great. The sequel takes place at a different location, at a resort in the mountains, if I remember correctly, and that gave me a lot of similar vibes as in, I think it's called Dead Voices, the second book following up Small Spaces by Catherine Arden. So overall, this hit a lot of the buttons that I liked. This echoed a lot of works that I like, and I found it really creepy. So I really liked this, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Next, I tried Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a coming-of-age vignette story about a boy who is being raised by werewolves and hopes that he will be a werewolf one day, but he's unsure. I really liked that this was a slow-paced family drama about a family who is constantly struggling to make ends meet and also trying to balance being werewolves without being discovered as being werewolves and having to move across the country in consequence. I definitely found, though, that as cozy and challenging as those family drama parts of the plot were, they were contrasted greatly with a fair bit of animal violence. Not cruelty per se, but there's a lot of animal death in here because werewolves eat animals, etc. So I don't know how willing I would be to reread this, but if you somehow want a cozy and yet upsetting coming of age story, then Mongrels might be the perfect book for you. I gave it 3.75 stars, and I am glad that I read it. And then I read one of the top books of my year so far, The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. This is the second book that I've read by T. Kingfisher, specifically her horror novels. I read The Hollow Places last year, and it was one of my favorite books of the year, but The Twisted Ones actually was published before The Hollow Places. There are a lot of similarities, a lot of foils in characters and situations between The Twisted Ones and The Hollow Places, but they were distinct enough for me to enjoy them as their own entities. I really liked the folklore elements in The Twisted Ones. I thought the horror elements were done really well, and this was just a fun ride from start to finish. So I will definitely be reading all of the horror things that T. Kingfisher comes out with, and I might even tiptoe into some of her fantasy works just to get a fix in between those horror novels. I gave this 4.5 stars. And then I read Kiviuq and the Mermaids by Noel McDermott with illustrations by Toma Fazo-Gas. This is an Inuit story about Kiviuq, who is a hero, and how he meets some mermaids. And if you like horrific mermaids, then this is the book for you. There are so many illustrations that just creeped me out so much. This is a legend sort of story. There's not a huge ton of character depth, but this is harrowing for a children's picture book. I really enjoyed it though. I really liked those creepy mermaids. So if this sounds like something for you, then I would definitely check this one out. I gave it 3.75 stars. I also read Cherish Farrah by Bethany C. Morrow, which is her new release. I believe it came out in February of this year. This was for Acacia's Patreon book club. I picked this up not only because of that book club, but also because I quite enjoyed A Song Below Water, which I read from her last year, and I thought I would try this less fantasy and more straight horror thriller contemporary story. And I found that the perspective of Farrah, who's a unique character who struggles with empathy. She describes herself as cosplaying as being a teenage girl, so she's a very unique perspective to come from. However, I think that the horror elements came a little late in the plot for me, and I found myself a smidge confused at times. So I might be able to get more out of this upon rereading, but for now, A Song Below Water is definitely hands down my preferred from Morrow. If you're less of a fantasy person though, and really likes the idea of suburban, contemporary, upper middle class social horror, then this might be the jam for you. I also finally read Misery by Stephen King. This is one of the Kings that I have been meaning to try, though more and more I've become more apathetic to reading a lot of Stephen King. I really want to branch out to horror that isn't just King. But my impetus was one of my favorite podcasts, You Are Good, which talks about feelings by talking about movies. They did a book to movie comparison of Misery. This was just the kick in the pants to actually get Misery read. I read this really quickly over the course of, I think, 2.5 days, and it was good. It's what I expected it to be, but Stephen King is just never going to be my favorite writer, and I don't think he, apart from Joyland, is ever going to write a book that I love. So this was a fun ride. It was quality for what it was. I liked the claustrophobic 2 people in one room setting, which for the most of it was. It got really gory at times, which was not my favorite. And that is definitely one of the things that would make me hesitate on ever considering reading it again. But the characters were psychologically complex, so he did what he set out to do really well, but it just was not my jam. I gave it 3 stars, and that's about what I expected to get from this, so can't complain. And the last horror work that I will talk to you about today is The Ballad of Black Tom by Victor LaValle. I read The Changeling by Victor LaValle last year, and that, though maybe not one of the top books of the year, I'm not sure if it got to the top of the books. If it didn't, it should have, because I think about The Changeling every week. Not for any particular reason. My life does not mimic The Changeling, fortunately, but there are so many just aspects of The Changeling that continue to impress me when I think about it. So I was very eager to read this one because this is proper cosmic horror, which is one of my favorite subgenres of horror, or at least I think it is. I'm still exploring that. And I know this was hyped a lot when it came out. It's a novella, which makes it really accessible, but this is a lovely gem of a work. It was really enjoyable to read. It was hard to read, but I really liked the pacing. I liked where the horror elements were revealed and what those horror elements were. I enjoyed the juxtaposition of the horror of elder gods with the horror of racism in 1920s America. And when I got to the end, it was just wrapped up in a neat little satisfying, perfect little bow. And I just remembered closing the book and just smiling because it was just so well done. So I am really eager to follow Victor LaValle and whatever he comes out with in the future, and I will probably be trying some more of his backlist. And if you know for certain if it's LaValle or LaValle, please enlighten me in the comments because I did not do my homework. So I gave this 4.5 stars. So not too bad. No horror books that I didn't enjoy and quite a few that were up there in my heart and esteem. Let me know if you have any horror book recommendations for me or how you did in the first 2 months of 2022 on your Book-o-lutions. Thank you for watching, and until next time, try out that genre you've been meaning to and continue to be lovely.